I think a lot of people will wonder why, after a long and storied career in business, you decided to take on this job. And I know that you've known the president for a long while. I'm sure there is some patriotism at play as well. What did you think that you could change going to Washington? What did you set out to do when you took this job?
Well, there's a lot to do. First of all, the department has 47,000 employees. So just getting your arms around that, which involves everything from the Census Bureau to the Patent Office to the National Weather Service to NOAA to a million other things, activities in all 50 states and 60 foreign countries. So there's a management task that's a bit of a challenge. But the other thing is the president wants me very involved in trade negotiations, and so that's superimposed on top of the normal activities of the department.
And we'll get into trade in just a little bit here. I wonder if we could go back to your business career, how you regarded Washington when you were in business. As a businessman, what was the role of Washington?
Well, it all depended. Often they were a handicap, they were a nuisance, they were an impediment, but on a few occasions they were actually very helpful. When we bought into the steel industry, when it was on its rear end, President Bush put in temporary tariffs that let us have time to get the new union contract and the new restructuring to work, and it turned out to save 100,000 jobs. So it worked well for me as an investment and worked well for the country in terms of job preservation.
What surprised you most, now having been on the job for close to 100 days, going to Washington, about the way it works? Again, you have your objective of what you'd like to do. What about the obstacles that you've encountered thus far?
Well, the major obstacle has not been internal to the administration. Major problem is the Republican Party is a little less unified than I had hoped, and the Democratic Party seems more unified in opposition than I would have hoped.
Well put. You were, if I'm not mistaken, a Democrat for a long while. How important is party to you? What does this president say, his election say to you about the role of the traditional parties in this country?
I think his election says much more about what's happened to the average citizen than it does about partisan politics. The average citizen has been neglected, has been abused, feels neglected, and feels abused, and in this election decided they'd had enough of that and they were going to try a bit of a different direction. And that's the direction we're heading in now.
What was it about Donald Trump, the politician, that attracted you to him? Again, you knew him for a while as a friend. What made you think that he was going to be a viable candidate and somebody who would be a good president?
Well, because I think he was the only one of the candidates going way back into the primaries who truly understood the angst that exists in middle-class America and the anger that exists there. I think that is the formative sentiments that elected him president.
He understood it. How did you see that? How did you see that playing out, and how did you know that that was a quality that you'd want the next leader to have?
Well, since many of those same people were workers in our factories, I knew how they felt. I knew very clearly how they felt and knew that it was a very, very powerful movement. Its time had come.
We're here among CEOs of a number of mid-sized, fast-growing companies, and I know from talking to them, from talking to other CEOs, that certainty is very important. I know you know that. The president professes to know that as well. What power do you have in your current position to convey that, to do more to emphasize certainty of regulation and what the government is doing?
Well, we keep stripping away regulations that were imposed. The last 2 years of the Obama administration, they put in 7,000 new rules and regulations, some number of that magnitude. I don't think the U.S. was such a wild and woolly place 2 years before that we needed 7,000 more regulations. That's 20 regulations a day for a year.
How do you keep up with what's going on the matter of certainty? I can look at my cell phone 5 times a day and feel like we're no closer to a vote on health care, no closer to a vote on a spending bill. If we were to free associate right now and say, what do you think of when you think of Washington, certainty would not be the word to come up.
Well, Congress is all about process. Process is very important to it, and process is very complicated by the partisan spreads that I mentioned earlier. But we're confident we will get a health bill of some sort through. we're confident we will get tax reform through. The only question is exactly when. And that obviously is not totally in the control of the White House.
You've been in the cabinet room, of course. You were at Mar-a-Lago when the U.S. launched strikes on Syria. I wonder, from those two things, what you can tell us about the way this president leads, how he interacts with other cabinet members like yourself.
Well, it's an intense interaction. He likes debate among the people he listens to because he wants to be sure that every real question is thoroughly vetted. Having been in the Situation Room with him when the decision was made to launch the missiles, I was impressed at how meticulous he was getting into every detail, every alternative, every possible response by various outside parties, and what our response would be. It was a very careful, very deliberate process that consumed several hours.
We here in this room have seen him meeting with executives. They've come to the White House. They've sat in the East Room. They've sat in other rooms of the White House meeting with him, telling them what's on their minds. What are the next steps from that? In other words, you've reestablished this level of engagement with the business community, one that many business leaders say wasn't there during the previous administration. What are the next steps there? How do you maintain that kind of dialogue with the business community?
Well, first of all, some of these groups that we meet with have a regularly scheduled quarterly session, and they generally get homework assignments between the
You're
sessions.
assigning it.
Pardon?
He's assigning it.
Our side and
Yeah.
corporate side. I don't view them as two separate sides, but the two groups. And they're taking it very seriously, and they come in with very detailed, very constructive suggestions. Often that results in another assignment for commerce.
I want to pull up something here on the Bloomberg. We have all of this data at our disposal. This is the ECTR function, and it shows our trade relationship with the world. You can see it here. I'll describe it for those who are listening on radio, but it's a picture of the globe. You see the U.S. in the upper left, and these lines being drawn show the robustness or the size of the trade relationship that we have. I want to ask you, you've taken on this mantle of dealing a lot with trade, how you came to hold the beliefs you have about trade. I think of the emphasis that you've put on enforcement. You've said that's incredibly important to this administration. You've talked about the importance of trade deficits as well. I think we have a chart showing our trade deficits with Canada and China. Where did you come to those beliefs? How did you come to those beliefs? How did you develop your trade philosophy?
First of all, it takes years, or has in the past taken years, to negotiate a trade agreement. So once you have it, it's a little foolish not to enforce it, because whether somebody's a good trading partner or a bad one, they need to play by the rules, and there has not been enough emphasis on enforcement. You've seen some of the actions we've taken recently, big numbers, big products, big countries, because we're trying to send the message, yes, we want to have trade agreements, but we want trade agreements that are enforced and lived up to. And we're going to make sure that that happens. And that's why you're seeing these billion-dollar, in effect, fines being levied on people who are not agreeing.
My colleague Tom Keene was just speaking with the former chair of the Federal Reserve, Ben Bernanke, and they were talking about what would happen if NAFTA were to disappear, if we were to scrap that agreement. Chairman Bernanke said that that would be a bad idea. There would be bad effects of doing that. Is that part of the plan? Do you think you'd scrap it entirely?
You can't replace something with nothing. That's not what this is about. What this is about is renegotiation of NAFTA. And at the end of it, sure, there won't be the old NAFTA. So in that sense, it will be scrapped. But the idea that we're just going to have no concept of trade relation to either Canada or Mexico is a silly idea. That's not the intention.
What's your message to the folks here in this room, those watching, those listening as well, about the U.S.'s role in the world? We've heard the president talk about America First. You've talked about America First as well. These are leaders of companies that have a very global footprint. How does that change under this administration, the role that the U.S. plays in the global economy?
Well, we're going to be playing the same role as before, except we're going to be more assertive about it being done in a proper and more balanced fashion. It's not inherent in the concept of free trade that one nation absorbs as its deficit the cumulative surplus of the entire rest of the world. That's not an essential ingredient to free trade. Number two, many countries talk free trade and in fact are quite protectionist, China being one of those. We are about the least protectionist country in the world, and we have the biggest deficit while the protectionist countries have big surpluses. Those facts are not going to continue to coexist.
The president sat down with two of our reporters, Margaret Talov and Jennifer Jacobs, earlier this week in the Oval Office, and something he brought up was a reciprocal tax. Can you offer any more detail on what that is, what that might be? He says it's something he's considering.
It's not a tax, it's a concept, and it's a very valid concept. When you think about it, the original concept of free trade was that each nation would export whatever it does best and cheapest, would import whatever it does least well and most expensively, and then produce and consume domestically everything else. That's the concept of it. Now, that gets muddied up when you get into currency manipulations, when you get into tariff barriers and things of that sort. So what the president had in mind is something like this. We have on automobiles a 2.5% tariff. Many other countries have a 25% tariff. The EU has a 10% tariff. There's an imbalance in those things. But under WTO's present rules, you have the most favored nation clause, meaning if we have a 2.5% tariff, it needs to apply to everyone except someone with whom we have a free trade agreement. So the conceptual problem is, if we have 2.5% tariff and you have 25%, how do I get you to agree to reduce your 25% tariff to zero if I reduce mine? The gap is too big. So a concept of reciprocity is an important and useful concept. There are structural problems to it, but there's a logic to it.
There could be a logic to it. I can see you advocating for it. What do you say to those who say these have been negotiated over the course of many years as part of big trade agreements? It's something that the U.S. cannot do unilaterally. Is that the structural issue then, going back to the WTO and reworking these tariffs?
Well, just the fact that it's been negotiated many years ago doesn't mean that it can't be changed. All of these trade agreements have provisions for cancellation. In the case of Nafta, it can be canceled by any of the three parties on 6 months' notice. Nafta is, at best, an obsolete agreement. Take again automotive. They have a concept called rules of origin, country of origin, saying what percentage of the parts in a car that get Nafta duty-free treatment can come from outside Nafta. Well, they did it in such detail that many of the parts they described aren't even used in cars anymore because automotive technology has changed. So that whole section, while it was reasonably well-intentioned to have some degree of protection to the NAFTA countries, it's totally obsolete. NAFTA didn't know anything about digital because digital didn't really exist. Services weren't as big as they are now, especially financial services, internet, the whole thing. So there are a lot of things that are just missing from NAFTA that are increasingly important in today's world. And then there's the whole question of dispute resolution mechanisms and enforcement.
I'm going to move on from trade in just a sec, but let me just pick out the semantics here for a sec. Obsolescence, to my mind, implies the fact that it needs to be replaced. It's no longer useful. When you think about NAFTA, are you thinking about revising that agreement or, in fact, doing something totally different and putting it in its place?
Well, there are parts of NAFTA that are okay. There are parts of NAFTA that have worked. There are some concessions that the NAFTA partners made in connection with the proposed TPP, the Trans-Pacific Partnership. There's no reason to throw those away. We would view those as the starting point.
You were just at the Milken Institute Global Conference in California. It's been a very busy week for you. You've been traveling quite a bit, and you spoke to some of my colleagues there as well. You said you were meeting with old friends and colleagues at that conference, many of whom did not vote for Donald Trump to be president of the United States. What do they ask you about him? What are they curious about, these business leaders, about how he's running the government? What do you say to assure them or to convince them that they should be supporting him?
Well, for one thing, a lot of them have volunteered that they are supportive, and we certainly have room for reform sinners in terms of the political environment.
On the economy broadly, there is so much seismic change happening. I remember before the election, you and I talked on set in New York. We talked about manufacturing. Let's talk about that in a minute. But let me ask you about the forces that are reshaping business in this country. A movement toward more automation, toward more being done in the back office, the fact that jobs are changing themselves. How are you positioned in this job to make sure that people in this country continue to have jobs going forward in light of those big changes to the economy?
Well, I've been working very hard as part of Ivanka Trump's Workforce of the Future project. And the sad thing is that, our educational system is and has been for some little while failing the youths of the country. They don't teach very much high school physics anymore. They don't teach much high school chemistry, don't teach much high school math. Similarly, in colleges, relatively few students are taking those subjects, and yet those are very much involved with the jobs in the future. Contrast it to China, Korea, Japan. More than twice as high a percentage of college students there takes STEM courses as here, and there are many more, particularly in China, many more total students. So if a higher percentage of a larger student base is taking STEM than here, that's a problem. And that's a problem we have to solve in the educational system and in the workplace itself. We convened 3 German companies recently in Washington, Siemens, BMW, and Schaeffler, a big privately owned German auto parts company. We're really impressed with and they all have operations in the U.S., mostly in small rural communities in the South. So when they got there, they had nobody with factory skills. They worked with the local community colleges, they made joint programs, and now they have very, very productive workforces. So it can be done, but what we're trying to do is figure out something we can roll out that will deal not just with the needs of big companies like those who need hundreds and hundreds of people, but also will help the little company that only needs 3, 4, 5. A guy who needs 3, 4, 5 welders can't really afford to do a whole special program. So we're trying to solve the problem both at the large employer end and at the small employer end.
I know everyone here in this room bears some responsibility for finding talent and hiring talent and training a talent. What role should the government play in all of that? In other words, if there is a skills gap, if you need Americans to be able to do other things, does the government have a role? What should that role be in encouraging that to happen?
Well, I think it's essential. What are the fundamental responsibilities of government? First of all, to protect its citizens, and second of all, to try to provide for their well-being. So it's obviously an essential function. One of the problems with it right now is there's something like 41 different federal entities dealing with education. That's probably 39 too many.
When you look at manufacturing, there is a move, as I said, to more automation. The president has, on the campaign trail as a candidate, promised that we'll have more manufacturing in this country. As president, he's delivered speeches around the country saying, in effect, the same thing. What does manufacturing look like to you in a year's time, in 5 years' time? We talk about bringing jobs back. Are these the same jobs that left? Are these different jobs? How are they different?
Well, they may be different jobs because the mix of the economy is changing. The key thing is that they be the same people, that we don't leave the people behind.
How cognizant are you, how cognizant is he of the fact that with all of these promises, it may be time limited, that he's made promises to Americans on the campaign trail that he's going to do this. Now he's in office, you're in office, the realities of governing come into play. Do you feel under time pressure to do this quickly? What's a reasonable timetable for you to get more manufacturing jobs back in this country, in quantity?
Well, we're already starting. Toyota's launching new factories. Ford canceled their plans to go to Mexico. It's happening every single day. But it's not happening 1 million workers at a time. It's 500 workers here, it's 1,000 workers there, it's 50 workers somewhere else. So it's the cumulative effect that will be there. And a lot of the benefits will come from deregulation. one of the tasks the president gave Commerce Department was to survey American manufacturers, ask them, what are the biggest problems you're having with permitting? What are the biggest problems with rules and regulations? We've now gotten those results in. We're collating them and analyzing them. And very shortly, we'll be making very specific recommendations to the president as to courses of action.
We've seen him write and sign a lot of executive orders and executive actions. We were talking at the beginning of the interview about the challenges of Washington, of looking at and working with Congress and how difficult that can be. Do you expect we're going to see more executive action? Do you expect to see that as a principal tool the president is going to use? How do you see the relationship with Congress going forward when it comes to things like regulatory reform?
Well, we will do as much as we can by executive order, by fiat, by departmental policy, because that's the most efficient way to do it. The least efficient way is to do it through Congress, especially because they right now have a couple major tasks in front of them, the health care and the tax reform being two among them, let alone passing a real budget for the next year.
That's a lot.
Yes.
And I wonder, I wonder if there was spirited debate within the White House about what should be prioritized. In other words, you have those three things going on, and in any given year for the Congress to be pursuing one of them would be a really big, ambitious undertaking.
Well, we need all of them because all of them need fixing. And it's pretty important to get health care done before the tax because we need the savings from that to help buy down the tax rate. And the only way we're going to get a tax bill through is through reconciliation. And that means you need a Congressional Budget Office scoring over a 10-year period. So it's quite interactive. Otherwise, we would have just gone with tax reform perhaps first, because it's in some ways less controversial than the health care.
Is the relationship between the White House and Congress better? Are you spending time with colleagues in Congress? Has it improved since, a few weeks back, I suppose?
Well, on a one-on-one basis, there are no relationship problems. It's just that, as I say, the Republican Party has some extremes of view. You have some very conservative people, you have some moderate people, and it's sometimes difficult to get them to coalesce on something somewhere in between their positions. Whereas the Democratic side seems very much to be unified in opposing everything that we do. Take my own confirmation. That was not particularly controversial. At the end of the day, I got 72 votes in the Senate, so there was a lot of bipartisan support. And it was reported out of the committee with unanimous vote, both of the Democrats and the Republicans. Nonetheless, it slow-walked me for 2 months. That was unnecessary.
Let me close just by asking you about how you hope to shape this role. I think about your predecessor, Secretary Pritzker, who championed the Trans-Pacific Partnership. Turned out the way that it did, but she was also very keen to open new markets. She traveled to Cuba. That was a priority for her as well. What would you like your imprint on the department to be? How would you like to be remembered as a leader of the Commerce Department?
I would like it to be that I helped improve the total amount of trade going on in the world, especially between the U.S. and others, but did so with a lower deficit for the U.S.
Does your job change when, presumably, Robert Lighthizer is confirmed as the U.S. trade representative? Again, you've been carrying the mantle here, perhaps in part by default. He hasn't been confirmed. How does your responsibility for trade change after he's confirmed?
Well, I'm looking forward to Bob Lighthizer's confirmation. We need reinforcements. Trade is very complicated, very time-consuming, very intellectual resource heavy. And Bob is a wonderful practitioner. I've known him for quite a lot of years. We've worked together on a number of matters, including the steel matters, going back some years. So we can't wait for him to get to be confirmed. That's number one. Number two, the relationship will be a collaborative relationship. The feeling of this administration is that the more intellectual horsepower we can bring to bear on these topics, the better.
Lastly here, is there a place or a region that you want to develop a relationship with that is better? Looking at that chart again just a moment ago, seeing the strength and the size of our trading relationship with China or with Canada, Is there a place that needs help, that needs to have more action, more interaction with?
Well, on that score, I'm very pleased to announce that this morning, Secretary Mnuchin and I, the two of us, are heading up the U.S.-China economic dialogue. That Secretary Mnuchin and I had a very constructive conversation with Vice Premier Wang Yang.
So China at the top of the list.
Yes, China is the outgrowth of the summit at Mar-a-Lago. As you know, we've agreed to try our best to have some actual deliverables within the first 100 days. I don't know why the whole world is getting 100-day wacky, but
We're past it. We're past it.
but they are. In any event, we're working very hard to try to make sure we do have deliverables. And if we do, it'll be pretty remarkable because trade talks are normally denominated in multiple years, not multiple days.